Well, I'm not going to make a judgment on that. I don't think you can bear the sword for the state and be a Christian. That's what the state does in Romans 12:13. Paul speaks about the state bearing the sword legally. I don't think a Christian should occupy that particular office because Christians are not supposed to be bearing the sword. So it would seem to me that being part of the world government, at least in that capacity, would be contraindicated for anybody claiming to be a Christian. Now, one might work for the tax office or something, and maybe things, there's a lawyer, even in the New Testament, forgotten his name, who works for the government. That's fine. But to be bearing the sword for the state, I would have to have said to Mr. Adam, are you sure you're doing right there? I'm not his judge, ultimately.
Yeah, I would ask in return, can you love your enemy and kill them at the same time? So Jesus, clearly in Matthew 5, actually, he goes beyond that. He says, pray for those who persecute you. So can you kill the one persecuting you? I think that's a good question. And also, you brought up Romans 13 about submitting ourselves to the governing authorities. And obviously, common sense would dictate that if the governing authorities tell you to do something contrary to what Jesus commands you, who are you going to obey? So obviously, we don't take that to the nonsensical cliff, if you will. But what I want to say about Romans 13 is that sometimes, as you know, Anthony, the chapter breaks in Scripture do not help. And you have to remember that chapters, verses, they're not inspired. They were created millennia later. They're not inspired. They're created much later to facilitate reading. And we do appreciate it. Chapter breaks, verses, makes it easier. But when you're reading this section of Scripture, please read it in the context of what Paul says just in the last chapter, towards the end. Bless those who persecute you. Bless, do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud. Enjoy the company of the lowly, the humble. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Carefully consider what is right in the eyes of everybody. If it's possible, on your part, live at peace with everyone. Do not avenge yourselves. Now, that is an interesting command. These are commands, by the way, okay? Because what does Paul go on to say about another party here, another group called the governing authorities? And how do I know they are separate from that group I just read? Because they're doing things antithetical to what I just read. For example, I just read, do not avenge yourself. But then Paul talks about this group and says they bear the sword as an avenger for the state or the governing authorities. You see the contradiction there? Can you not avenge and avenge at the same time? Can you be an avenger and not an avenger at the same time? It's obviously contradictory. I'll give the floor to you.
Well, no, that's fine. And we quote two examples of disobedience to the state. The midwives who were asked to kill the babies whose birth they were supervising refused to do it. They were disobeying what the state said. The other example would be in Daniel, where the people were asked to bow down to the statue of a pagan king, and they refused to do it and almost lost their lives in that attempt. So there is certainly a point at which you cannot obey the state. But in general, if it's not contrary to the will of God, then you should do what the state tells you, should pay your taxes, drive on the correct side of the road, and not resist the authorities when they're doing their job.